This is part 2 in a deep dive series on Edward Abbeys Masters thesis. I'm going to start with a little recap on who Edward Abbey was. He was an environmental writer, most famous for writing Desert Solitaire, A Season in the Wilderness, published in the late 1960s. He wrote it in 1968. So this thesis was written 10 years before that time. He died in the late 90s. He was 32 when he wrote this thesis, and he was already being investigated by the FBI for suspicion of trying to overthrow the government at the time he was writing this. And in part 1 of this thesis, we talked about the introduction, and the core point in that introduction before we get into Godwin here is he's trying to answer two questions in this thesis. Number one is, to what extent is the traditional association of anarchism and violence warranted? And number two, in so far as the association is a valid one, what argument have the anarchists presented explicitly or implicitly to justify the use of violence? So those are the questions Abbey's trying to answer here in his thesis, and we're going to get more into that now. So let's start with a little background on William Godwin, just in case you're not familiar with that scholar. William Godwin was an English philosopher, political theorist, and novelist who lived from 1756 to 1836. He is known for his radical political and philosophical ideas, particularly advocacy for anarchism and his belief in the power of reason and individualism. Godwin's most famous work is An Inquiry Concerning Political Justice and Its Influence on Modern Morals and Happiness, which was published in 1793. In this book, Godwin argued that government and institutions were unnecessary and that society could be organized on the basis of reason and individualism. This book is considered a foundational text in philosophical anarchism. Godwin was also the father of Mary Shelley, the author of Frankenstein, and he wrote several novels himself, including Caleb Williams, which is considered a classic of English literature. Here we go. Paragraph 1, Part 2, William Godwin. So I'm just going to summarize what Abbey says here in this first paragraph, which is that Godwin was the grandfather of European anarchism. Not the first, but the second. And he really was the first to create a terminological distinction that other anarchists utilized to define their ideas, such as the necessary components of human society, the parasitic organ that feeds society, which would be big government in this case from Abbey's view, and the need to have a de-evolution of government. Paragraph 2 starts by talking about how Godwin is against violence. And when we turn the page, we learn more about this idea. The first 3.5 sentences are cut off from the field of view, so I'm going to start by reading those line by line. Illegal forces go so far as to include even opposition to tyrannicide. He is willing to grant that a tyrant may be killed in repelling a personal assault, but this is the only exception he will allow. He argues that if a nation under dystopianism is ready for liberty, its people will dispose of their tyrant openly, publicly, and with a slow legality. And this is where we can see the rest of the words on the page. From there, Abbey goes on to talk about how Godwin states that tactics like assassination will only hurt political movements, and they lead to greater evil than the evil eliminated. And we close this paragraph by learning that in Godwin's view, the libertarian society is dependent on the majority of people believing in the goals of that society. The last paragraph on this page talks about how Godwin opposes insurrections and revolutions. It's when I see that word insurrections, I think about how the FBI was investigating Edward Abbey for that very thing. So Godwin may have been the godfather, or grandfather, but he did not fall into Edward Abbey's two categories of inquiry very well for this thesis. And for that reason, I'm a little perplexed as to why he chose to include Godwin in this thesis. If he was alive today, I would definitely ask him more about that choice. All right, on to page 7. So page 7 starts with a quote from Godwin that talks about the unenlightened and unprepared people. And Abbey talks about the opposite of that following the quote, which is that in the face of enlightened conviction, Godwin believed that oppression must wither away, for, as he also held, government cannot exist without the active consent and support of citizenry. So that's the whole majority rule supporting argument Abbey uses to support that idea. And then we go on to the second case for revolution, the minority rule, and Abbey likes this idea better because of its implausibility. Basically, a small group of people isn't going to overtake a big group of people with their ideas alone. And that is what we have on page 7 of this document. Page 8. Page 8 starts with a closing paragraph from the former page, summarizing Godwin's ideas, and then it talks about them a little bit more in terms of this idea of majority rule and why that's important. Lastly, in the bottom part of the paragraph before the quote on page 8, Godwin is talked about in terms of writing pragmatically to distance himself from the tactics used in the French Revolution, which were going on at the time Godwin was writing this. So as we can read here, writing during the time of the French Revolution, Godwin took great pains to clear himself from any suspicion of supporting a cause which might employ methods like those demonstrated by the French. Furthermore, now we get to the part of this paragraph where he's introducing the next quote. Being a true child of enlightenment, Godwin enjoyed a strong faith in the powers of reason and in certitude of steady, unswerving social progress through the application of reason. And we can see that in the following quote, which talks about how, and I'm going to summarize this, if people with good ideas expand and proliferate those good ideas, things will steadily increase for the benefit and good of all humanity. It's a very optimistic way of thinking. through a framework which Abbey refers to as the, enlightenment reason way of thinking. So that's page 8. Page 9 starts with the quote from page 8 that was introduced, and I'm just going to read a little bit of this because it really does encapsulate Godwin's ideas, because it's his ideas and his words. Happiness would it be for mankind if those persons who interest themselves most zealously in these great questions would confine their exertions to the diffusion in every possible mode, a spirit of inquiry, and the embracing every opportunity of increasing the stock and generalization, the communication of political knowledge, right? Godwin is saying, take these good ideas and spread them around in a very English mid to late 1700s way of writing. Now we get to the conclusion. Abbey needs to connect these ideas of Godwin's to the questions in his thesis proposes, which are, to what extent is the traditional association of anarchism and violence warranted, and insofar as the association is a valid one, what arguments have the anarchists presented explicitly or implicitly to justify use of violence? Well, Godwin justifies it in the act of self-defense. So he is not purely a pacifist within the circles of anarchism. He thinks self-defense is a reasonable use of violence, and maybe that's why he chose to include him, because as an intro to this, it's a little bit of a softer takeoff into the controversy of anarchism. If you start with someone who's a pacifist all the way to the line of self-defense, I think a lot of people can get around that idea, especially when you compare that to more radical anarchists that maybe believe in violence and a lot of other sort of instances and modalities. Abbey then goes on to talk about how he classifies Godwin is not a pacifist, even though he only believes in violence when used in self-defense, listing some other anarchists that were pacifist, like Leo Tolstoy. And he illustrates this concept with a quote at the bottom of page 9, which reads as follows. It is not because human life is so considerable value that we ought to recoil from the shedding of blood. ... Death is in itself among the slightest of human evils. An earthquake which would swallow up hundreds of thousands of individuals at once would chiefly be regretted for the anguish it entailed upon survivors. In a fair estimate of those it destroyed, it would often be comparatively a trivial event. The case is altogether different when a man falls by the hand of his neighbor. Here 1,000 ill passions are generated. The perpetrators and the witnesses of murders become, unrelenting and inhuman. Those who sustain the loss of the relative or friends by catastrophe of this sort are filled with indignation and revenge. Distrust is propagated from man to man. On page 10, this quote ends and the section on Godwin ends. I'm going to finish reading it. Dearest ties of human society are dissolved. It is impossible to devise a temper more inauspicious to the cultivation of justice than the diffusion of benevolence. Put simply, we conclude the section on Godwin by seeing him acknowledge that the world can be a very evil place where lots of people can die in a natural disaster, and that's just part of civilization and the world, while also acknowledging that it's not okay morally for humans to kill each other for political means, and that Godwin could be an anarchist and not do that. So, in summary, Godwin was the first anarchist Edward Abbey writes about in his master's thesis, part 2. He's an anarchist that is known as the grandfather, in Edward Abbey's eyes, of European anarchism. He is not a pacifist. However, he doesn't condone violence in any case for revolutionary purposes, except if someone is trying to hurt you and you attack them in self-defense. And that is Edward Abbey's take on Godwin. In the next part in this series, we will talk about the next anarchist here in part 2, Pierre Joseph Proudhon. I'll have to look up how to better pronounce that name. In any case, that's all I got for you today. Let me know in the comments what you think of Edward Abbey's ideas here below. Thanks for watching. We'll see you around.